The global trade in arms has grown considerably, according to a new study, even as the world is still grappling with the consequences of a severe economic crisis. Just what's behind this boom in the arms trade, and who stands to gain most from increasing defence budgets? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. A new report says that countries in Asia have been the main drivers of weapons growth in the past 10 years. SIPRI, that's the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, reports that in the 5 years to 2011, global arms transfers were up 24% on the previous 5 years. It says that Asian countries accounted for 44% of all weapons imports. India was the biggest buyer, making up 10% of global imports. It overtook China, which fell to fourth place. But Beijing's decline in imports coincided with an increase in arms exports. The outflow of Chinese-made weapons jumped by 95%, making China the sixth largest supplier of arms in the world, just behind the UK. Well, SIPRI said this arms business is maintained by the United States and Russia, which make up about half of the globe's arms exports. From the report, we learn that the US accounts for 30% of global arms exports, selling arms to more than 80 countries. Russia's share of the global arms trade stood at about 24%, with most of its military supplies being shipped to China. Germany is the world's third biggest weapons seller at 9%, followed by France at 8%. So, what's behind this boom in the global arms trade? To help us answer this question, we're joined by our guests today from Stockholm. Pieter Wezeman, Senior Researcher at SIPRI ArmsTransfers Programme. In Beijing, we're joined by Alexander Votravers, Professor of International Relations at Webster University in Geneva and editor of the Swiss Military Review. And from Johannesburg, we're joined by Joseph Dube, the Africa Coordinator for the International Action Network on Small Arms. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Pieter Wezeman, given that the arms trade is murky, sometimes corrupt, often shrouded in secrecy, how did SIPRI reach its findings?
Well, what we do is really collect this kind of information from a whole lot of open sources, and we focus on major arms, the kinds of arms which are most visible. So we go through all these sources, we collect the information and we put it all together. And of course, we cannot be sure that we complete. We know that there are also deals which we have missed. We know that there are deliveries which have happened without us knowing about it. And of course, when you talk about the illegal arms trade, that's yet another issue. There, of course, you can find very little reliable information.
We said that the US accounts for a great deal of the world's arms trade. Do you foresee a time when China and indeed India may match the amount spent by the US on defence, or in terms of exports even? And if so, when is that likely to happen?
Well, you see in China a constant increase in military expenditure, but when we talk about military expenditure, we have to realize that the United States lies far ahead of any other country in the world. When I'm not mistaken, their military expenditure lies at around $500 to $600 billion a year. Compare that to China, which is somewhere, I don't know the exact figure right now, but it is below 100, the same for Russia. So they are far behind the US. When it comes to arms exports, it's even stronger. We see for China now that they are on the increase, but they haven't really made a major breakthrough. Their main client has been Pakistan and remains Pakistan, and they haven't really found, let's say, significant buyers of their military equipment elsewhere yet. So that will probably never happen in my lifetime, I would almost say, although I can't foresee the future, of course.
Let's bring in Alexander Votravers in Beijing, who wants to make a comment. Alexander, why has the arms industry continued to boom in the midst of global economic strife?
Well, I think that we're seeing budgets being reduced not only in Europe, but now increasingly in the United States. And on the other hand, after many years, basically 2 decades of the 1980s and 1990s, when the Middle East accounted for 25 to 30% of the arms intake, we are seeing, as you mentioned, a great raise in arms procurement in Asia. And there are several reasons for that. Of course, many of the strategic interests, but also simply inflation. And perhaps to answer the question that you posed to my colleague just a few minutes ago, it's not surprising that China's exports should be growing with indeed great investments in the African continent in particular, and also a very substantial inflation. One has to keep in mind, however, that there are statistical biases, and when one talks about the United States as the greatest arms exporter, one is always talking about value and not quantities of weapons. Indeed, for every F-15 fighter jet exported by the United States, you can probably buy several thousands or tens of thousands of rocket-propelled grenades that are manufactured in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and other places, including China.
Alexander, is it possible to put a finger on why spending on arms has increased as it has, while budgets for other things have been slashed due to the economic circumstances?
Well, indeed, if you look at the constant military operations that the United States armed forces have been in now since 2001 at least, you can certainly explain that with over 50% of the world expenditure on defense, it is also normal that the United States and a certain number of other countries would account for a sizable proportion of the arms exports. If we talk about Russia, the situation is quite different. Russia sees very clearly its defense industry as a comparative market advantage, and therefore has geared a lot of its industrial output on very sophisticated arms exports, in particular combat aircraft to Asian countries. If we are talking now about European countries, you have to remember, have used defense as one of the most successful federating efforts with, in particular, the creation of EADS, which is a very large defense-related company today. Indeed, it manufactures the Airbus jets, but it also manufactures a great number of other common defense-related products. The situation would be the same for many developing countries. The arms industry is a very strong, relatively competitive public and therefore well-protected sector in many of these developing countries. I mentioned Pakistan before, but we can talk about many countries in the Middle East, including, of course, Israel. And this explains why there is such an effort and such a will of developing countries, small countries, not the great powers, but middle-range countries, to support and continue to host defense industries. It's an issue of sovereignty.
Let's bring in Joseph Dube. Joseph, I know you want to respond to what you've heard so far, and then I'm going to ask you a question about South Africa's arms imports. But what do you make of what you've heard?
Well, I think I would pretty agree with both your other guests, but I think what is important here to emphasize is the lack for regulatory instruments internationally. That's the reason why you've seen the growth in terms of arms trade, the transfer of arms that governments are busy trading. But also, I think the other factor is that you've seen the uprise of people in the Middle East, as well as, for example, in Greece, in Europe, because of the meltdown. So what governments are now doing is that they're trying to arm themselves, prepare for themselves to then attack its own citizens. And I think it's important to emphasize that unless and until we have an arms trade treaty that will galvanize and regulate this kind of arms trade, you'll see the decline in terms of the trade and the cost or the monies that are going through into defense.
Okay, I want to come on to the issue of an arms trade treaty in just a few moments, but Joseph, South Africa imports some 70% of all the arms that come into Africa. That's according to SIPRI. Why does it need to spend so heavily on arms, given that it doesn't appear to face much of an external threat?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's a question of the definition of power globally. That for you to be seen as a powerful state, it's defined by your defense and the budget that you put on defense and the equipment that you acquire constantly every year. If you look, for example, South Africa joined BRICS, and Brazil is one of the BRICS members, and the expenditure or the import of arms that have been increasing steadily in Brazil, it's equivalent to what South Africa is trying to copycat from some of the members of the BRICS. So South Africa trying to reposition itself in the continent and globally means that they have to then look at what's their defense mechanism, what's their defense power. It's unfortunate that while they focus much on expending more money on defense equipment, they also forget to then put political and diplomatic power to reposition themselves.
Okay, so what you're saying is, if by repositioning, if it wants if South Africa wants more clout on the global political stage, it has to invest in defense.
Exactly. I think what it has to do is to say, look, we are powerful. Here we are. Look at our military hardware. Look at who we are. We are able to respond. And I think we have seen their involvement in the last 8 months, from April to December last year, that they have been participating in operations. I think there were about 3 operations they were involved. They were involved in 4 exercises in the continent. So in other words, they are trying to show the world as well as the continent to say, we are powerful, we are able to respond, we are able to engage, we are able to defend not only the territory of South Africa, but also being part of the peacekeeping missions, either in the African Union or in United Nations.
Okay. Pieter Wezeman, will emerging nations like South Africa continue to buy their arms from the traditional suppliers in the West, or do you think that they will switch to suppliers who are perhaps a little less fickle, not bound by their government's political interests, as many Western companies are?
Well, I think you have a very mixed picture there. I mean, you have a country like South Africa, which actually has chosen to buy its arms in Europe, from Germany, from Sweden, from the UK, countries which normally are seen as being restrictive. But in the case of South Africa, that wasn't really an issue because it's a democracy and countries in Europe found it perfectly okay to supply arms to them. And I think that's true for most of the major emerging countries. Brazil, you see the same thing. They could have bought from Russia, but actually, as it looks now, they actually turn to France, to the UK, and not to the kind of countries which don't put any conditions on their arms sales. Same to a large extent true for India, which gets most of its weapons still from Russia, but also looks for weapons in Europe, in France, in the UK again, but even from the most, let's say, restrictive country in the world, you could argue the country which puts most conditions on arms sales, and that is from the United States. You see a developing relation there between India and the United States, which is very new, which only has taken place in the past few years. And there even the US has offered the most advanced type of weapons to India, and India has an interest in it. They actually are keen to buy them. Also because they know if you want the best equipment, you're not going to get it right now from Russia. Or in the case of African countries, for example, if you want the best equipment, you're not going to get it from China. You still get better equipment from Russia or from Europe. So they're still very much forced to actually look at the traditional suppliers in Europe and in the United States.
All right, Peter. Well, many Western countries have something of a paradoxical stance when it comes to arms deals and arms deal involving Sweden and Saudi Arabia, for instance, is a particularly good example. According to classified documents, the Swedish Defence Research Agency, FOI, has been assisting Saudi Arabia in building an advanced weapons plant. But the recent report sparked an outcry in Sweden, which prides itself on standing up for human rights. The Swedish Prime Minister has defended the deal, saying his country has this type of agreement with Saudi Arabia as it enables trade and exchange of contacts. Alexandra Votravas, how do you explain the apparent hypocrisy at work here in the West when it comes to fomenting armed conflicts through arms trade on the one hand, while in public promoting peace on the other?
Well, I think that there's probably one third party or a missing link in the equation, and we've sort of understood that there were many compensation or compensation agreements that were involved in many of these arms deals, and I think that this indeed is a sign of continued partnership and technology transfer with these countries. So let me just put it this way. Would Saudi Arabia be in a better situation, or would Saudi Arabia be better encouraged on the path to improved human rights if not Sweden or not Switzerland or not other European countries, but perhaps China or other countries would be left as the sole or the main suppliers of Saudi Arabia? I'm not so sure. So, nature doesn't like the void. I think that in many ways, to establish long-lasting, reliable partnerships and contracts, compensation agreements in business, in technology, is one of the ways that influence of Western countries can be implanted. Actually, to say it very bluntly, most of the developing world, the developing countries that are criticizing the Western countries, criticize them for the dependency that, or the conditional aspects of these arms deals.
Okay, let's get back to the issue that Joseph raised a few moments ago, Alexander. As the charity Oxfam says in its call for an international arms trade treaty, we have the most cumbersome rules on selling bananas and iPods, but no solid internationally binding rules on the arms trade. Why is that?
Well, that's not quite true, but indeed, when the World Trade Organization, at the time the International Trade Organization was negotiated in 1947 at the Havana Conference, there were a certain number of items that were specifically left out, and one of these was the defense industry, because the United Nations Charter provides for every country to be able to develop its own arms industry and maintain its sovereignty and its rule of law in its borders. So it was believed that this was a strategic sector and this should not be regulated internally. In particular, neutral countries, countries that were not a part of an international alliance, such as the Western democracies and the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, were supposed to be able to acquire weapons on a free market. Now the situation is a little bit different, because there are regulations that already exist, and quite a number of regulations already exist. Most of the Western countries have such regulation, and in particular prohibit third-party selling. So it's the re-exportation of arms that have been sold to a certain country are usually not authorized or are subject to specific authorization. Certain types of weapons are not exported by the United States of America and other countries. So there are national laws that already exist. Okay,
I know Peter wants to come back, but let's bring in Joseph Dube once again. Do you think that that an international arms trade treaty would work if the major arms manufacturing nations refused to sign up to it?
Look, I think it will work. I'm positive that if we have an arms trade treaty, we will, to some extent, achieve the goals of reducing, gun deaths that we're seeing around the world, the abuse of human rights. We'll see the reduction, but also we'll see more development, happening. I think IANSA and other organizations did a research a couple of years, and we realized that we're missing about 18 billion, US dollars every year in Africa. Money that is supposed to go into development, but is being lost because either there's conflict or there is unregulated arms trade. But also, I think it's important to indicate that many of the, these manufacturing countries, big countries, or the P5, are also supporting the UN register. And we are saying that let's take the UN register categories that are already there, let's regulate them, let's make sure that these arms don't actually end up in the wrong hands. And a clear example that happened recently in Africa was the arms that were supplied by China to Zimbabwe. And unfortunately, I think according to one of the reports that came out, that those arms ended up reaching Zimbabwe. So if we do have an international arms trade treaty, these countries were called to answer or to respond to why they allowed the supply of arms to go into a country that will end up abusing, violate international law, violate human rights as well. So I think I'm positive that if we can have an arms trade treaty, we will achieve a lot in terms of violation of human rights and disrespect of international law by many governments that we've seen, not only here in Africa, but also if you see even in the Middle East.
Pieter Wezeman, there is something of a legal vacuum when it comes to the international trade in arms. With so many vested interests at play, I mean, is it even possible to begin negotiating such a treaty?
Well, that's been extremely hard, but of course we shouldn't forget that there are actually international norms, there are international arms embargoes. The United Nations, for example, has decided, the Security Council has decided to impose arms embargoes on a whole range of occasions since the end of the Cold War. I can't remember the exact number now, but since the end of the Cold War, we have had something like between 20 or 30 or even more international arms embargoes. Last year, we had an international arms embargo on the Gaddafi regime. That was a very clear example of how countries can actually come to agreement about when it is unwanted and when arms actually may contribute to conflict, and therefore cases in which we actually have to stop such arms transfers. And that has been agreed by a number of countries, including those countries which usually don't like to put conditions on arms sales, Russia and China. Same is true for Iran. Iran can basically not buy any arms on the international market because there is an international UN arms embargo. So there is some hope when we look at what has been achieved in that field. But yes, it's going to be extremely hard to put together all those countries and all those different views, not also to forget that the arms trade treaty has to be negotiated between the exporters, but also very much the importers which are involved. And they, of course, don't want to see any restraint on their possibilities to acquire arms.
Alexander Vertravers in Beijing, you want to comment?
Yes, I can just simply say that, yes, indeed, there are many embargoes that are voted. And let's look at the very obvious, the situation of Syria right now. Putting in place an embargo on Syria will probably not incapacitate the regime's and security forces' possibility for cracking down insurgents, but it will also make it very difficult to support the various armed groups that are trying to rebel against the regime. So it's a very ambivalent situation, and embargoes do not always create favorable conditions for democracy and the respect of human rights and the protection of populations. Number two, let me also say that you mentioned Iran. Iran is a fantastic example because weapons continue to be purchased and procured on the black market. They are just many times more expensive than the regular arms that can be checked and can be controlled. And number three, let me talk about the fact that there are international regulatory regimes, and let me just talk about the most obvious, which is the Geneva Conventions, international humanitarian law.
Okay, we're rapidly running out of time. Pieter Wezeman, we've got about a minute left on the programme. How long before companies based in the East begin to challenge the dominance of the current leading global arms manufacturers?
I don't think they will challenge real dominance, but I think they will play a much more important role. Take, for example, China, but also South Korea. Obviously, major industry it has, therefore it can produce advanced equipment which countries want. So I think we'll see a development in which some of, let's say, the second chair, like the UK, France and Germany, will see real strong competition from countries elsewhere in the world, particularly also in East Asia.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we are out of time. The news waits for no man. That's next on Al Jazeera. Thank you to all my guests today in Johannesburg, Joseph Dube, in Beijing, Alexander Votravers, and in Stockholm, Pieter Wezeman. And thank you very much indeed for being with us on this edition of Inside Story. Send us your feedback as always. Email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. In Doha, I'm Adrian Finnegan. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again. Bye for now.